Okay, so for anyone out there prepping for the UPSC exams, staying on top of current events is like essential, right? It's
Yeah,
so crucial to cut through all the noise and figure out which developments are really going to matter in the long run.
absolutely. And the thing is how big tech companies operate, and especially how they use our data and, whether they're playing by the rules. That's a massive area of focus right now.
Yeah, for sure. And, the scrutiny on these tech giants isn't just a flash in the pan headline. It has some pretty fundamental implications.
Right. Fundamental implications for the digital economy, how we regulate these companies, and for us too, as both consumers and, citizens in this digital age.
Which is exactly why we're going deep today into this recent order from the CCI. That's the Competition Commission of India.
Oh, right. Against Meta.
Yeah, against Meta. We've gone through all the details, pulled primarily from the Hindu to bring you guys the key insights so you can really grasp what this decision means.
Yeah. And, our mission in this deep dive is pretty straightforward. It's to unpack the core issues around, data-driven dominance
Right.
in the digital marketplace and
Mhm.
specifically within the Indian context.
Okay.
We want to provide you, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, with a clear and concise understanding of this case. It's a landmark case, really, and its broader ramifications for competition law and, the whole digital landscape.
Okay, so let's jump right into the CCI order against Meta. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist, right? It was a pretty big deal. It landed on November 18th, 2024, and it came with a hefty fine, a 213.14 crore fine.
Huge.
Yeah, but maybe even more significant was the 5-year ban on Meta sharing WhatsApp user data with its other platforms, Facebook and Instagram, specifically for advertising.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is the CCI's reasoning behind the order. They determined that WhatsApp's 2021 privacy policy update, that was a big one. It actually constituted an abuse of Meta's dominant position.
Yeah.
And not just in one, but two key digital markets. So we're talking the market for over-the-top or OTT messaging services,
Yeah.
think WhatsApp versus traditional SMS,
Right.
and then also the online display advertising market.
Right, exactly. And the way that this policy update was rolled out seems to have been like a key factor in the CCI's judgment because it was basically presented as a non-negotiable thing, right? Like agree to share your data or you can't use WhatsApp.
Right, it's a take it or leave it approach. And according to the CCI, that really just solidified Meta's already strong, powerful position in the market.
Exactly. And, by leveraging its huge presence, right? It's almost everywhere in the messaging app
Mhm.
space. Meta was basically making users consent to data sharing that would then benefit its advertising business.
Right.
And that brings up this question of, how free is our consent really in a digital world that's dominated by just a few major
That's
players?
the big question, isn't it?
Yeah. And of course, the story doesn't end there because Meta, they challenged this order, right?
Right. They appealed to the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal, so the NCLA.
Right.
And as of January 23rd, 2025, the NCLA TEEC granted a stay on both the ban and the penalty.
Okay.
But there's a catch. Meta has to deposit 50% of that massive 213.14 crore fine.
Oh, wow. So it's not completely off the hook.
Not at all. It's this really interesting interim order that highlights the constant tension between, you know, how a company operates, especially with all that user data they handle, and the potential for those operations to actually stifle competition.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike.
It is. It's a delicate balance, and regulators around the world are, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and that brings us to like a core issue here, the power of data in digital markets. Like it's almost impossible to overstate how important it is.
You're telling me data is like the most valuable resource in the digital economy.
Mm,
It's unlike any traditional resources we've dealt with before
right.
because you can reuse it, reanalyze it over and over again. You can get continuous insights from it.
Huh.
And most importantly, it creates this compounding competitive advantage for the companies that have a lot of it.
Right.
You know, every single data point might seem small on its own, but together they create this massive picture
Right.
that refines algorithms and just sharpens the targeting capabilities of these companies.
And just think about how Meta operates, right, with billions of users across all its platforms. It's constantly collecting a massive amount of data.
It's a fire hose of information.
Yeah, and this data fuels the algorithms that power everything from our personalized news feeds to those incredibly targeted ads we all see.
It's all about tailoring the user experience to keep us engaged. And guess what? That engagement generates even more data.
Right, it's a cycle.
And this is where network effects come in. It's a crucial concept.
Yeah.
The more users a platform has, the more valuable it becomes to other users.
Right, because everyone's there.
Exactly. And that means more data, which leads to better services, which attracts even more users. It's like a snowball effect. It just keeps growing and grow.
It's also possible to compete with that.
It is incredibly difficult for new companies to break into a market like that. Think about trying to start a new social media platform when all your friends are already on Facebook or Instagram.
Yeah, exactly. You're starting from scratch.
Right. And meanwhile, these companies with massive user bases, they're just gathering more and more data and becoming even more influential.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that, Meta isn't the only one facing scrutiny in India.
Right. Google's had its own run-ins with the CCI too, right?
Absolutely. The CCI's action against Google back in 2022, that's another prime example. They were hit with a 1,337.76 crore fine
Wow.
for abusing their dominant position in the mobile operating system and app store markets.
Mm.
So they were forcing phone manufacturers to pre-install Google's suite of apps on Android devices.
Oh, wow.
And the NCLAT upheld that decision in 2023. So it really shows how much attention regulators are paying to these digital gatekeepers.
Right.
These companies that control essential digital infrastructure.
Yeah, these cases really highlight how these companies can leverage their control over, things like a messaging platform or an operating system to not only just maintain their dominance, but actually grow it sometimes in ways that really hurt competitors and, potentially even us, the consumers.
It's a valid concern, right?
Yeah. And it makes you wonder how other countries are dealing with these same issues. What's the global perspective on this?
So when we look at the global regulatory landscape,
Mhm.
we see a lot of different approaches.
Okay.
In the United States, for instance, there's been a huge focus on antitrust investigations and big lawsuits.
Okay, so let's talk about the U.S. approach to Meta, the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC filed a pretty major lawsuit back in 2020.
Yeah, that was a big one.
What was their main argument there?
So the FTC basically accused Meta of engaging in this pattern of anti-competitive acquisitions. So they were specifically talking about the acquisitions of Instagram back in 2012 and WhatsApp in 2014. And their argument was that these weren't just about expanding Meta's services, but they were strategic moves to get rid of potential future competitors.
Oh, wow. So eliminate the competition before it even really emerges.
Exactly. They wanted to control the social media and messaging space.
And the FTC isn't just looking for fines, they're going for something much bigger.
Yeah, they're actually pushing for a breakup of Meta's business.
Mm.
They want the court to force Meta to sell off Instagram and WhatsApp.
Wow, so undo those acquisitions.
Yeah, essentially rewind to try and create a more competitive market.
That's a huge deal if that happens.
It would be a massive shift in how we approach antitrust in the tech world.
And Meta's not the only one in the hot seat in the U.S. Google's facing some heat too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In 2024, a U.S. district court actually found Google guilty of violating the Sherman Act.
It is.
That's like the foundational antitrust law in the U.S.
Okay.
And the problem was Google's exclusive agreements in the search and online advertising markets. The court said these agreements basically gave them a monopoly over digital advertising.
Wow, so similar to Meta, there's talk of breaking up Google too.
Yeah, there's been discussion about potential structural remedies, including breaking up their ad business.
So it seems like there's a real change happening in the U.S. with how they're regulating these big tech companies.
Yeah, there's definitely a shift towards a more aggressive stance. They're not afraid to take on these giants.
All right, so let's shift gears and look at Europe. The European Union has been pretty active in this space for a while now.
Yeah, the EU has kind of become a global leader in regulating big tech. They've got this comprehensive approach that tries to balance consumer protection, data privacy, and fair competition in the market.
Okay, so what are some of the key pieces of legislation they have?
Well, two big ones are the Digital Markets Act, or DMA, which came into effect in 2023, and the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR from 2018.
Okay, let's break this down. So the DMA that targets these huge digital platforms, the ones they call gatekeepers, right? Like Meta, Google, Amazon, those kinds of companies.
Yeah. Exactly. And the DMA basically sets a bunch of rules and prohibitions to try and stop these gatekeepers from doing anti-competitive things.
Like what kind of things?
So, for example, it mandates interoperability for some services like messaging apps, so you
Right.
can switch between different providers more easily.
Right.
It also bans self-preferencing, so a gatekeeper can't unfairly favor their own products or services over their competitors on their platform.
Okay, so level the playing field a little bit.
Exactly. And importantly, it tries to give users more control over their personal data.
And the GDPR, that's more focused on data protection itself, right?
Yeah, the GDPR has been a game changer when it comes to data protection and privacy. It sets really strict rules for getting consent to process personal data, and it comes with big penalties for companies that don't comply or misuse user data.
Oh, wow.
It's really about giving individuals more power over their own information.
And we've seen specific action from individual countries in Europe, too, right? Like
Yeah,
Germany's Bundeskartellamt, they went after Meta in 2019.
yeah, that was a landmark case. The German Competition Authority said that Meta was abusing its dominant position by combining user data from all its different platforms, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, without getting proper consent from users.
Oh, wow.
So Meta had to let users in Germany opt out of having their data merged across all those services.
Mhm.
It was a big step toward regulating data monopolization.
And the EU itself hasn't been shy about finding Google, has it?
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
Over the past decade, the European Commission has given Google multiple antitrust fines totaling more than $8 billion.
That's a lot of money.
They've gone after them for manipulating search results, for favoring their own shopping service, for restricting Android device manufacturers, and even for their practices in the online advertising market.
So it's clear that the EU is taking a much more proactive and comprehensive approach to regulating these tech companies compared to some other places. So bringing this back to India, where do we stand in light of all this global action?
Well, the CCI's order against Meta, that shows they're willing to take action. But India's current competition law, the Competition Act of 2002, it was written back in 2002.
Right.
It's got some limitations when it comes to these data-driven monopolies that are popping up everywhere.
Yeah, it makes sense. The old antitrust laws were really designed for a world where market dominance was all about physical stuff and, controlling prices.
Right, physical assets, production costs, that kind of thing.
But digital markets, they work so differently. It's all about data network effects, things that the old laws didn't really anticipate.
That's exactly it. So there's a growing argument that we need to specifically address data monopolization when we're figuring out if a company is dominant in the digital world.
Oh,
And that probably means rethinking some of the basic concepts in antitrust law, like what does market power really mean in the age of data? What does dominant position mean when you've got these massive network effects?
right. It's a whole new ballgame.
It is, and we need to update the rule book.
So what could those legal reforms look like in India, practically speaking?
Well, there are a few ideas being tossed around.
Yeah.
One is to require more interoperability between different platforms and services,
Right.
so it's easier for users to switch providers.
Right.
And that would reduce the lock-in effect that these big companies benefit from. Another idea is to look at ways to share data in a controlled way.
Mm.
So a few companies can't just hoard all the information and create an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
And we also have to think about how competition law works with data protection laws. That's super important.
Right.
We need a joined-up approach integrating the Competition Act with the new Digital Personal Data Protection Act from 2023,
Mm.
kind of like what the EU is doing with the DMA and GDPR, a holistic framework that tackles both anti-competitive behavior and data exploitation.
So India has a chance to learn from what's happening around the world, especially in the EU, and create a system that works for our own digital landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
By looking at global best practices and tailoring them to the Indian context, we can create a digital marketplace that encourages both innovation and fair competition while protecting people's data and privacy.
Yeah, and this is all super relevant for those of you prepping for the UPSC exams because it touches on economics, competition, law, data governance, and how different countries are regulating this stuff.
That's a big part of the syllabus.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive, we've looked at the CCI's action against Meta and how that reflects a global trend of cracking down on these big tech companies.
Right. There's this growing concern about data exploitation and anti-competitive behavior.
Yeah, and we've seen different approaches in the US and the EU, but for India, the takeaway is that we need to update our laws to deal with these powerful data-driven monopolies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These companies are shaping the future of the digital world, and we need the right tools to keep things fair.
And on that note, here's a final thought for everyone to consider. Given how fast technology changes, how can India create a regulatory framework that not only stops anti-competitive practices today, but can also adapt to the challenges that are coming down the road?
That's the million-dollar question. It's something that policymakers and future administrators really need to grapple with. It's a question with huge implications for our digital economy and society as a whole.
We hope this deep dive, using insights from sources like The Hindu, has been helpful for your UPSC prep.
Yeah, we've tried to give you a clear and concise breakdown of a very complex issue.
If you found this discussion useful, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment with any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future deep dives.
Your feedback helps us make this content as relevant and informative as possible.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.